The moment my husband looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Margaret, I want a divorce," I felt the room tilt slightly to the left. But that wasn't the part that truly stopped my breath. It was what he said next, with the calm confidence of a man announcing the weather. "And I'm taking everything." The words landed between us like a dropped plate. For 43 years we had shared this house, the creaking oak floors, the blue ceramic teapot that always whistled too early, the narrow windows that let in golden light every morning. And now, Raymond Whitmore, 70 years old and suddenly standing straighter than I had seen him in a decade, was looking at me as if I were a stranger renting space in his life. "The house, the accounts, the cabin," he continued, folding his hands neatly on the table. "My lawyer says it's all very clear." I stared at him, trying to understand how the man I had cooked for, cared for, and defended for most of my life could speak with such cold certainty. Outside, a wind pushed through the maple trees in the yard, rattling the old iron bird feeder Raymond had once insisted on installing himself. Funny how quickly things that felt permanent could start sounding hollow. "You're serious," I said quietly. Raymond gave a short laugh. Not the warm chuckle I remembered from years ago, but something sharper, polished. "Margaret, I've been serious for months." Months? The word slid under my ribs like a thin blade. So while I was planting tomatoes in the garden, he had been planning this? While I was repairing the loose hinge on the pantry door, he had been sitting somewhere with a lawyer, deciding what parts of my life he intended to strip away. "And you believe the house is yours?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair, confidence practically glowing off him like a cheap aftershave. "It's in our marriage. Everything is. Don't make this difficult." I studied his face. The thin gray mustache he trimmed every Sunday morning, the little scar near his eyebrow from when he slipped on the dock 20 years ago. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the entire life we shared. Then I noticed the folder beside his elbow. Legal paper, typed tabs. Prepared. Raymond had not come to talk. He had come to declare victory. "You've already filed," I said. He smiled slowly. "Of course." There was something almost theatrical about the way he said it, as if he had rehearsed this scene many times before walking into my kitchen tonight. I stood up and walked to the window. The backyard stretched out in quiet evening light. The herb garden, the old wooden bench, the narrow path that led to the shed where Raymond used to spend hours pretending he enjoyed woodworking. 43 years. And now he spoke as if I were a guest who had overstayed. Behind me, I heard the rustle of paper as he slid the folder slightly across the table. "You should look at the documents," he said. "It'll help you understand how this will go." I turned back slowly. Raymond's confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. The kind that comes from believing every piece on the board is already in place. He thought he had already won. What Raymond Whitmore didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that years ago, after one particular night, when I realized exactly what kind of man my husband truly was, I had made a quiet decision. A decision that would one day matter very, very much. But Raymond had never asked about paperwork. Raymond had never asked about the house. And Raymond had never imagined that the quiet woman sitting across from him might understand far more about ownership than he did. "Hello, my dear friends, Grace here. Tell me honestly, if someone you spent 40 years with suddenly said they were taking everything, how would you react?" Write in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these stories together. Raymond tapped the folder again, impatience creeping into his voice. "Well," he said, "aren't you going to read it?" I looked down at the stack of legal pages, then back at the man who believed he had already erased me from my own home. And for the first time since he walked into the kitchen, I smiled. "Raymond," I said calmly, "you might want to be very careful about what you think belongs to you." His smile faltered, just for a second. And in that tiny moment of silence between us, I realized something important. My husband had spent months preparing to take everything, but he had never prepared for the possibility that the house was never truly his to take. Raymond did not like my smile. I saw it immediately in the way his fingers stopped tapping the folder. For 43 years, he had studied my reactions the way some men study stock charts. He knew when I was frightened. He knew when I was tired. And he especially knew when I was about to surrender. But this smile didn't fit any of those categories. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked back to the stove where the kettle had just begun to whisper its quiet pre-boil song. It was an old enamel kettle, pale green with a tiny chip near the spout. Raymond once said it was the ugliest thing in our kitchen. I kept it anyway. Small rebellions become habits after 40 years. "I'm making tea," I said calmly. "Margaret." His voice had hardened, but I poured the water slowly into a teacup, dropped in a sachet of Earl Grey, and sat back down at the table as if we were simply discussing the weather. Raymond stared at me like a man trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "You're taking this very calmly," he said. "Well," I replied, stirring the tea, "it's not the first unpleasant surprise marriage has delivered." That landed. His jaw tightened, but he pretended not to notice. "Look," he said, sliding the folder toward me again. "You can fight if you want. That's your right. But Daniel says it'll only make things harder for you." Daniel. So that was the lawyer's name. "You've hired someone already," I said. "Of course I have." "How long?" Raymond hesitated, and that tiny pause told me more than any confession. "A while," he muttered. I opened the folder. Inside were exactly the kinds of papers I expected: asset summaries, bank statements, property evaluations, and a neatly typed proposal for division. Raymond had highlighted several sections in yellow, like a proud student presenting homework. The house, the retirement accounts, the cars, even the lake cabin. According to this tidy stack of paper, Raymond Whitmore intended to walk away with nearly everything. I flipped another page. His reasoning was simple, insulting, really. The document described him as the primary financial contributor throughout the marriage. It mentioned my limited independent income. It even implied that maintaining the house and managing daily life somehow counted less than a paycheck. I let out a quiet breath. "Daniel wrote this?" I asked. "Yes." "He sounds very confident." Raymond leaned back again, his earlier swagger returning. "That's because the law is clear, Margaret." I closed the folder. The law. Funny word. The thing about Raymond was that he loved simple explanations. Clean answers. Straight lines. He had always believed the world worked like the instruction manuals he kept in the garage. Step 1, step 2, finished. But real life, especially legal life, rarely followed instruction manuals. "You should probably start packing," he added casually. That sentence hung in the air. Packing, as if I were a guest checking out of a hotel. "And where exactly would you like me to go?" I asked. Raymond shrugged. "With your sister, perhaps, or one of those senior apartments near the pharmacy. I'm sure you'll manage." For a moment, the kitchen felt very small. The wooden cabinets I had refinished myself, the terracotta jar filled with dried bay leaves, the narrow shelf where I kept my favorite cookbook, the one with the handwritten recipe for saffron chicken that Raymond once begged me to make every Sunday. All of it suddenly looked different. Not because it was leaving me, but because Raymond believed it already had. "You've really thought this through," I said. "I have." "And you're certain the house belongs to you?" Raymond smiled again. "Yes." That confidence again. That dangerous, comfortable certainty. I folded my hands in my lap and studied him carefully. The man sitting across from me had spent months planning how to dismantle my life. He had lawyers, paperwork, and a very expensive belief that he understood the law. But Raymond Whitmore had always had one flaw. He never looked closely at details he assumed were beneath him. And the house? The house was nothing but details. "I suppose we'll see what the court says," I said quietly. Raymond snorted. "Oh, Margaret," he said, shaking his head. "The court is going to say exactly what I just did." He stood up, took the folder, and walked toward the hallway. "Start thinking about where you'll go," he added over his shoulder. "I'd hate for this to be uncomfortable." A moment later, I heard the bedroom door close. The house fell silent. I finished my tea slowly, staring at the kitchen table where we had celebrated birthdays, argued over bills, and once spent an entire night assembling a ridiculous wooden spice rack Raymond bought at a flea market. 43 years. And now he thought he could erase me with paperwork. I stood, walked to the small cabinet near the refrigerator, and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a thin leather folder, older, thicker, and containing documents Raymond had never once bothered to read. I ran my fingers across the edge of the papers and allowed myself the smallest breath of relief. Because Raymond was right about one thing. The court would absolutely decide who the house belonged to. And when that moment came, my husband was going to learn something very surprising. He had spent months preparing to take everything, but he had no idea what he was actually walking into. The next morning, Raymond behaved as if the house already belonged to him. He came into the kitchen wearing the navy sweater he liked to put on when he wanted to look respectable, the kind of sweater that made people assume he was a reasonable man. He poured himself coffee, opened the newspaper, and didn't even glance at me. 43 years of marriage, and suddenly I had become background noise. "Morning," I said. He nodded faintly, eyes still on the paper. There was an article about rising property taxes in the county. Raymond tapped the page with his finger, as if the universe itself had written it for his benefit. "See?" he said. "Another reason this place needs proper management." Proper management. That was a new phrase in Raymond's vocabulary. Apparently, I had been mismanaging the house I had maintained for 4 decades. I buttered a piece of toast slowly and watched him over the edge of my teacup. "What time is your lawyer expecting you today?" I asked. Raymond looked up sharply. "Who said I'm seeing him today?" "You did," I replied calmly. "Yesterday, when you said Daniel had already prepared the documents." Raymond stared at me for a moment, trying to decide whether I had just been lucky with my guess. Then he shrugged. "Late afternoon," he admitted. "We're reviewing the next steps." Of course they were. Men like Raymond never liked leaving things to chance. He folded the newspaper and stood up. Oh, he added casually. Someone will be coming by later to look at the property. I blinked. Look at the property? A realtor, he said. Just preliminary. Preliminary. The word echoed around the kitchen like an insult. You're already planning to sell the house? I asked. Not immediately, Raymond said with a thin smile. But Daniel suggested we get an updated valuation. You know, for the division of assets. Division. Such a polite word for theft. I finished my tea and stood, carrying the cup to the sink. What time? I asked. 3. I nodded. Good, I said. Raymond frowned slightly. Good? I'd hate to miss it. For the first time since he announced the divorce, Raymond seemed slightly uncertain. You don't need to be here, he said. It's just a walkthrough. I live here, I replied. The silence stretched. Raymond cleared his throat and grabbed his coat. Suit yourself, he muttered. A moment later, the front door closed behind him. His car engine started, then faded down the road. The house was quiet again. I walked slowly through the living room, running my fingers along the back of the old leather sofa. Raymond bought that sofa during what he used to call his successful years. It smelled faintly of cedar polish and the strange herbal oil he rubbed on his knees. Every corner of this house held some piece of our history, but history alone wasn't what mattered anymore. Paper mattered. Documents. Signatures. Ownership. I went back to the kitchen and pulled the leather folder from the drawer again. The paper inside had yellowed slightly over the years, but the ink was still perfectly clear. My name. The legal language. The trust structure Helen had helped me establish after that disastrous year when Raymond nearly ruined us with one of his investments. He had called it a temporary setback. I had called it a warning. That was the year I learned something important about my husband. Raymond believed money solved problems, but he never paid attention to how money was protected. He signed documents the way most people signed birthday cards, quickly and without reading more than the first line. That habit had saved me more than once. And today, it might save this house. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to the drawer just as the phone rang. The sound startled me. Almost nobody called the landline anymore. I picked it up. Hello? A calm female voice answered. Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. This is Helen Mercer. We spoke briefly last night. I felt a quiet sense of relief settle into my chest. Helen Mercer had the steady voice of someone who understood storms. I reviewed the information you sent, she continued, and I'd like to meet today if possible. That would be good, I said. There was a brief pause. Your husband seems very confident, Helen added. I looked out the kitchen window at the maple trees, swaying gently in the wind. Yes, I said. He does. Well, Helen replied evenly, confidence and ownership are not always the same thing. I smiled. No, I said softly, they aren't. We arranged to meet just after the realtor finished his visit. When I hung up the phone, I noticed something curious. For the first time since Raymond had walked into this kitchen and announced he was taking everything, I didn't feel afraid, because Raymond Whitmore had spent months preparing his attack. But today, the first real step of the defense was about to begin. And if there was one thing my husband had never learned in 43 years of marriage, it was how dangerous a quiet woman could become when she finally stopped being patient. At exactly 3 o'clock, a silver SUV rolled slowly into our driveway. I watched it from the living room window, standing beside the tall bookshelf Raymond had insisted on building 20 years ago. The shelves were crooked, of course. Raymond had never been very patient with measurements. A woman stepped out of the car, smoothing the front of her beige coat. She looked to be in her early 40s. Sharp posture, tidy hair, the confident walk of someone who spent a lot of time telling people what their homes were worth. The realtor. Raymond had wasted no time. I opened the front door before she had a chance to knock. "Good afternoon," I said. She looked slightly surprised. "Oh, hello. I'm Claire Donovan. I'm here to meet Mr. Whitmore." "Of course," I said calmly. "Please come in." She stepped inside, her eyes immediately beginning the professional scan. Realtors do. The floors, the walls, the ceiling height, the windows. "This is a beautiful property," she said politely. "Yes," I replied. "It is." Raymond arrived about 10 minutes later. His car door slammed, and moments afterward he walked through the front door wearing that same confident expression he had carried all week. When he saw Claire already inside, he brightened. "Ah, Ms. Donovan, perfect timing." He shook her hand enthusiastically. "Raymond Whitmore," he said. "Thank you for coming." Claire smiled. "Happy to help." Raymond gestured around the living room. "As you can see, it's a well-maintained home. Large lot. Excellent neighborhood." I noticed he never once used the word our. Just the house. The asset. Claire nodded professionally and pulled out a small tablet. "Why don't we take a quick walkthrough?" Raymond immediately took the lead, moving through the house like a tour guide who had suddenly discovered he owned a museum. "This kitchen was updated about 15 years ago," he said. I almost laughed. Updated. That had been me. Stripping the cabinets, repainting the tiles, installing the brass handles myself, while Raymond sat on the porch, drinking iced tea and offering supervision. Claire examined the countertops. "Granite?" "Yes," Raymond said. I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence reveals more than arguments ever could. We moved through the dining room, the hallway, and then the study. Raymond spoke constantly, filling every second with numbers, improvements, and imagined market value. "And the backyard is nearly half an acre," he added proudly. Claire made notes. "Impressive?" Then she asked the question. "And the title is under both of your names?" Raymond answered before I could speak. "Currently, yes, but we're in the process of a divorce settlement." Claire gave a polite nod, the way professionals do when they hear family complications they'd rather not get involved in. "I see." We continued upstairs. When we reached the master bedroom, Raymond opened the closet and gestured at the space as if he were presenting a luxury hotel suite. "Plenty of storage," he said. Claire typed something into her tablet. "Very good." Then she glanced at me. "And how long have you lived here, Mrs. Whitmore?" 43 years, I said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's quite a long time." "Yes," I said softly. Raymond cleared his throat. "Well, times change." Claire finished her notes and slipped the tablet back into her bag. "I'll send a preliminary valuation later this week," she said. Raymond smiled broadly. "Excellent." He walked her to the door, thanking her again with the kind of charm he used whenever he wanted to look like a reasonable man. When the front door closed and her car drove away, the house fell quiet again. Raymond turned to me. "Well," he said smugly, "that went smoothly." I crossed the living room slowly and picked up the small porcelain bowl sitting on the coffee table. Inside were a few dried star anise pods I sometimes kept there for their faint, spicy scent. Raymond watched me with mild irritation. "You could at least pretend to care," he said. I turned the star anise pod between my fingers. About what? The house, he snapped. I looked around the room. The sunlight through the tall windows, the faint smell of cedar from the old wooden beams, the quiet ticking of the clock near the fireplace. Oh, Raymond, I said gently, I care very much. He frowned. Then you should start preparing yourself. For what? For the inevitable, he replied. That word again. I placed the star anise back in the bowl. Raymond stood there, completely certain he understood how the next few months would unfold. He believed the realtor's visit was the first step toward selling the house. He believed the paperwork in Daniel's office would secure everything. He believed the court would confirm what he had already decided. But the truth was something Raymond had never considered. The house was not simply a property, and the paperwork that mattered most was not sitting in his lawyer's office. It was sitting quietly in a drawer in my kitchen, waiting for the moment when Raymond Whitmore would finally learn that confidence and ownership are two very different things. I arrived at Helen Mercer's office just after 4 o'clock. Her building stood on a quiet street near the courthouse, a modest brick structure with narrow windows and a brass plaque beside the door that read, Mercer and Dalton, attorneys at law. It wasn't flashy, and that was exactly what I liked about it. Flashy lawyers tended to talk too much. Helen met me in the reception area herself. She was in her early 50s, tall, with silver beginning to show in her dark hair. Her handshake was firm, and her eyes had the calm focus of someone who had seen every kind of courtroom drama imaginable. Mrs. Whitmore, she said. Please, I replied. Margaret. She gave a small nod and led me down the hallway into her office. It smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the sort of expensive tea people buy when they want to pretend they aren't stressed. On one shelf sat a neat row of legal volumes. On another, I noticed a small ceramic bowl filled with wrapped ginger candies. Helen gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Let's take a look. I handed her the leather folder. She opened it carefully, the way surgeons open instruments. Calm, precise, respectful of what they might find inside. For several minutes, she said nothing, flipping through the documents one by one. The only sounds in the room were the quiet turn of paper and the distant murmur of traffic outside. Finally, she leaned back slightly. Well, she said. I waited. That explains your husband's confidence. My eyebrows lifted. It does? Yes, she replied. Because if I had only seen the documents he's probably working with, I might believe the same thing. I folded my hands in my lap. But? Helen smiled faintly. But he clearly never examined these very carefully. She tapped the page in front of her. This trust structure is quite thorough. I allowed myself a small breath. Years ago, when Raymond nearly lost a large portion of our savings in one of his brilliant investment adventures, I had insisted on protecting the house. Raymond had agreed at the time, mostly because he was too busy trying to repair his finances to read the paperwork. He signed where Helen told him to sign, and then he forgot about it. What does that mean for the divorce? I asked. Helen flipped another page. Well, she said thoughtfully, your husband can certainly try to claim the property as a marital asset. But the ownership structure places significant limits on that claim. She looked up at me directly. In plain English, Margaret, the house is not as accessible to him as he believes. I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen slightly. That's good to hear. Helen nodded, though her expression remained careful. However, she added, We shouldn't underestimate your husband. I gave a quiet laugh. Oh, I never do. People who enter a divorce this confident usually believe they have strong leverage somewhere, she said. Money, influence, narrative, something. Raymond definitely had narrative. For years, he had been the charming one at gatherings, the storyteller, the man who explained things with confident authority. Meanwhile, I had been the quiet wife who brought food and refilled glasses. Many people believed Raymond understood everything. Very few people ever asked whether that was actually true. What happens next? I asked. Helen closed the folder. Next, we prepare. For court? For everything, she said calmly. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellow legal pad. I want a complete timeline of financial decisions in your marriage. Major purchases, renovations, property taxes, improvements to the house. I nodded. That won't be difficult. Good, she said. Because if this becomes a contested property dispute, details will matter. Details. That word again. Raymond had always hated details. Helen continued. Your husband's attorney will likely argue that the house functioned as a shared marital asset, regardless of the trust. They'll try to paint the arrangement as procedural rather than practical. I tilted my head. And is it? Helen smiled slightly. That depends on how clearly we demonstrate its purpose. She slid the folder back toward me. Fortunately, she added, the documentation here is very clear. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun had begun to soften, casting long golden lines across the buildings. For the first time since Raymond sat across from me in our kitchen and declared he was taking everything, I could see the shape of the road ahead. And Raymond? I asked. Helen folded her hands. Raymond is walking into this situation, believing he already owns the house. She paused. That kind of confidence can be very dangerous. For him? I asked. Helen nodded once. Yes. I picked up the leather folder and stood. Then I suppose we shouldn't rush to correct his misunderstanding. Helen's smile widened just a little. No, she said. Sometimes the most effective strategy is letting someone walk confidently in the wrong direction. When I stepped back outside, the evening air smelled faintly of rain and distant chimney smoke. Raymond thought he was months ahead of me. But what he didn't understand yet was this. The moment he walked into that courtroom, he would be stepping onto a board he didn't even realize existed. And the piece he believed was his strongest advantage was the very thing about to collapse beneath him. Raymond became noticeably meaner after my meeting with Helen, not louder. Raymond had always preferred quiet cruelty. But there was a sharpness in his behavior now, like a man who had started tapping the walls of a house, looking for weak places. 2 days after the realtor's visit, I came downstairs to find 3 cardboard boxes sitting in the living room. My boxes. I recognized the old winter coats folded on top before I even stepped closer. Raymond was standing by the fireplace with his phone in one hand and a yellow legal pad in the other. What's this? I asked. He didn't even look up at first. Just organizing, he said. Organizing what? Your things. I walked slowly into the room. Inside the first box were my scarves, 2 cookbooks, and the little wooden spice grinder I had bought years ago from a market vendor who insisted it worked best for cardamom and cloves. I used it every winter when I made mulled cider. Raymond had dumped everything together like it was junk from a garage sale. You went through my closet? I asked. He finally looked up. Well, someone has to start separating things. Separating? Raymond shrugged. You won't be staying here much longer. The words hung in the room like smoke. I folded my arms. That decision hasn't been made. Raymond smirked. Oh, Margaret, it has. He tapped the legal pad. Daniel says it's better if we start preparing now. Makes the transition easier. Transition. That word had become his favorite lately. Everything was a transition. As if he were politely rearranging furniture instead of dismantling a marriage. I bent down and picked up the spice grinder from the box. The wood was warm in my hands from the afternoon sun coming through the window. Raymond watched me. You know, he said casually, you'd save yourself a lot of trouble if you just agreed to the settlement. I looked up. What settlement? The one Daniel drafted. I haven't agreed to anything. You will, he said confidently. I set the grinder on the table. And why is that? Because fighting this will cost money, Raymond replied. Time, stress. Lawyers love stretching things out. He leaned against the fireplace like a man delivering wise advice. You're not exactly built for a long legal battle. That was another one of Raymond's favorite tricks. The quiet suggestion that I was fragile, too emotional, too old, too tired. It had worked on people for years. Just not on me anymore. I met with a lawyer, I said calmly. Raymond froze. Just for a moment. You what? I met with a lawyer. The silence in the room shifted. Raymond straightened slowly. What lawyer? Helen Mercer. The name clearly meant something to him. His eyebrows pulled together slightly. Helen Mercer? He repeated. Yes. Raymond let out a short laugh, though it sounded forced. Well, that's unnecessary. Is it? Yes, he said quickly. Daniel and I already outlined everything. There's no reason to complicate things. I sat down in the armchair by the window. Raymond, I said gently, you told me 2 days ago you were taking everything. That's correct. And now you're surprised I spoke to a lawyer? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this began, Raymond looked slightly irritated. I just don't see the point, he muttered. The point, I replied, is understanding what belongs to whom. Raymond waved a dismissive hand. That's already clear. I tilted my head. Is it? He stared at me for a moment. Then he laughed again, louder this time. You're really going to drag this out, aren't you? I'm simply making sure everything is correct. Raymond shook his head and grabbed his coat. Well, he said, heading toward the door, Daniel will be thrilled. Lawyers love clients like you. He stopped at the doorway and glanced back. Just remember something, Margaret. Yes? When this is over, you'll wish you had taken the easy option. The door closed behind him. A moment later, I heard his car start and drive away. The house fell quiet again. I looked down at the 3 cardboard boxes Raymond had filled with pieces of my life, scarves, books, kitchen tools, objects he believed he could pack away like decorations after a holiday. I walked over, lifted the spice grinder again, and turned it slowly in my hands. Raymond believed this house was already his. He believed the paperwork in Daniel's office would prove it, and he believed that sooner or later I would give up. What he didn't understand was that every cruel little move he made, every box, every insult, every smug conversation with his lawyer, was quietly pushing this situation toward a place he would not enjoy. Because when Raymond Whitmore finally stepped into that courtroom, he was going to discover something very uncomfortable. The house he was so busy trying to take from me was never something he truly owned. The following week, Raymond began talking more. Not to me. Raymond rarely said anything honest directly to my face, but to everyone else. It started with a phone call I overheard one afternoon while I was in the hallway. Raymond was in the study, the door half open, speaking loudly in the tone he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable. "Yes, Linda, I know," he said into the phone. "It's unfortunate. Margaret is taking this very emotionally." I paused beside the bookshelf. Emotionally. That word again. "Of course I'm trying to keep things civil," Raymond continued. "But you know how stubborn she can be." I leaned against the wall quietly, listening. Linda Carter was Raymond's niece. She lived 2 towns over and had always treated him like a wise older brother instead of the occasionally reckless man he really was. There was a pause while she spoke on the other end. Raymond sighed dramatically. "Yes, I know she's lived here a long time, but that doesn't change the legal reality." Legal reality. Raymond loved that phrase lately. "Well, Daniel says the house will likely need to be sold anyway," he added. "It's the cleanest solution." Sold. So that was the plan. I moved away from the hallway before Raymond finished the call. Listening any longer would have been unnecessary. I already knew exactly what story he was telling people. Poor Raymond, difficult wife, unfortunate divorce. Reasonable man forced to deal with emotional resistance. He had been polishing that performance for years. Later that evening, I drove into town. The accountant's office sat above a small bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and warm sugar. I had known Arthur Klein for nearly 30 years. He had handled our taxes since Raymond first started his consulting business, back when his hair was still mostly black. Arthur looked older now, but his eyes were still sharp behind his thick glasses. "Margaret," he said when I stepped inside, "this is a surprise. I hope it's not an inconvenient one." "Not at all." He gestured toward the chair beside his desk. "What can I help you with?" I sat down and placed a small envelope on the desk. Inside were copies of several financial records: property tax payments, renovation receipts, insurance statements. Arthur studied them carefully. After a minute, he looked up. "Is this about the divorce Raymond mentioned?" he asked. So Raymond had already started his campaign. "Yes," I said. Arthur leaned back slowly. "He told me the house would probably be sold." "I'm sure he did." Arthur adjusted his glasses and tapped one of the papers. "These payments," he said, "most of them came from your personal account." "That's correct." He nodded slowly. "I remember advising you about that years ago." "Yes," I said. "You did." Arthur looked thoughtful. "Raymond never paid much attention to the property details," he added. "No," I agreed. "He didn't." Arthur gathered the papers neatly. "If you need documentation confirming these records, I can provide it." "That would help?" He smiled faintly. Raymond always assumed he understood the financial structure of things. I returned the smile. "That's a very accurate description." When I left the bakery, the air outside carried the smell of fresh brioche and roasted coffee beans. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk, watching the evening traffic roll slowly through town. Raymond was building his version of the story, but stories only worked when no one checked the details, and the details were beginning to line up. Arthur Klein was one. Tomorrow I would visit another. Robert Delgado, the notary who had witnessed a very important document years ago, a document Raymond had signed without reading. I got into my car and turned the key. Because while Raymond spent his days telling people the house would soon be sold, I was quietly gathering the people who knew the truth about how that house had actually been protected. And when the time came to explain that truth in court, Raymond Whitmore was going to discover that confidence was a very poor substitute for preparation. 2 days later, Raymond tried something new: charm. It started on a Thursday evening when I came home from the grocery store. The kitchen lights were already on, and for a moment I thought I had forgotten to turn them off before leaving. But when I stepped inside, I saw Raymond standing at the stove. He was stirring something in a saucepan. Now that alone was unusual enough to make me pause. In 43 years of marriage, Raymond had used the stove perhaps a dozen times, and half of those occasions involved burning eggs. "What are you doing?" I asked, setting my bag of groceries on the counter. Raymond turned with a smile that looked suspiciously practiced. "Making dinner." I raised an eyebrow. "That's new." "Well," he said lightly, "there's no law against a man cooking in his own kitchen." His kitchen. There it was again. I glanced at the stove. He was heating tomato soup from a can. Beside it sat a loaf of bread and a small plate of sliced cheese. Comfort food. Raymond must have believed nostalgia was a strategy. "I thought we could talk," he said. "About what?" "About being reasonable." I took off my coat and hung it by the door. Raymond ladled soup into 2 bowls and placed them on the table as if we were reenacting a peaceful evening from 20 years ago. For a moment, the smell of tomato and basil filled the kitchen, and I almost expected to hear the old radio we used to keep on the counter. But Raymond had already sold that radio at a garage sale years ago. "Sit," he said. I did. Raymond folded his hands like a man about to present a very logical argument. "I spoke with Daniel again today." "I'm sure you did." "He thinks we're making this harder than it needs to be." "We?" "Yes." Raymond pushed a sheet of paper across the table. "A revised proposal." I didn't touch it. "What's revised about it?" "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "Daniel suggested a more balanced approach." Balanced? That word almost made me smile. "And what does balance look like to Daniel?" I asked. Raymond glanced at the paper. "You would keep your personal savings in the car." "The car I already own?" "Yes." "How generous." Raymond ignored that. "And I would keep the house." "Of course." "And the cabin," he added, naturally. "And the retirement accounts." I leaned back in my chair. "So nothing has actually changed." Raymond frowned slightly. "Well, you'd avoid a lengthy court battle." "Raymond," I said gently, "this proposal gives you everything you asked for 2 weeks ago." "That's because it's fair." I looked down at the paper but still didn't pick it up. "You're very confident," I said. Raymond nodded. "Yes, I am." There it was again. That quiet, unwavering belief that he had already solved the puzzle. "You know," he added, "Daniel also said something interesting." "Oh?" "He said courts often prefer simple solutions." "I imagine they do." "And selling the house would make things much simpler." I tilted my head slightly. "Selling the house?" "Yes," Raymond said. "Then we split the proceeds." Now that was new. Not generous. Raymond never did generous, but strategic. If he couldn't claim the house directly, perhaps he believed selling it would still give him half. I finally picked up the paper. The language was polished, careful, and clearly written by someone who billed by the hour. But it rested on one very convenient assumption: that the house was available to divide. I placed the paper back on the table. "I'll have Helen review it," I said. Raymond's smile thinned. "You don't need to involve her in every conversation." "I do if lawyers are writing the documents." He sighed. "Margaret, You're making this unnecessarily complicated. I looked directly at him. Am I? Yes. Raymond, I said calmly. You're the one who walked into the kitchen 2 weeks ago and announced you were taking everything. That was the reality of the situation. Was it? The silence stretched across the table. Raymond's eyes narrowed slightly. You keep saying things like that, he said. Like what? As if you know something. I picked up my spoon and tasted the soup. It was slightly too salty. Raymond had always added too much salt to everything. Do I? I said. He leaned forward. If you think you have some kind of legal trick. I don't think anything, I interrupted gently. Raymond stared at me for several seconds. Then he leaned back again, studying my face carefully. For the first time since this began, I could see it clearly. Doubt. Not much. Just a small crack in the wall of certainty he had built around himself. You know, he said slowly, Daniel still believes the house will end up being sold. I'm sure he does. And if it does, Raymond continued, you'll regret dragging this out. I finished my soup and set the spoon down. Raymond, I said quietly, I'm not dragging anything out. He frowned. Yes, you are. No, I said. I'm simply waiting. Waiting for what? I looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where he had declared victory 2 weeks earlier. Waiting for the moment when everyone involved understands exactly who owns what. Raymond laughed again, but this time the sound wasn't quite as confident. We already know that. I stood and carried my bowl to the sink. Behind me, Raymond sat very still at the table. Because for the first time since he had started this entire process, he was beginning to suspect that there might be something he had overlooked. And the truth was, he had. Something very important. Something that would soon become impossible for him to ignore. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. I noticed it the moment I stepped through the tall glass doors that morning. The air inside had that quiet, serious weight places acquire after decades of arguments, verdicts, and people learning things they would rather not learn. Raymond was already there. He stood near the end of the hallway beside a tall man in a charcoal suit I immediately recognized as Daniel Crowley. The two of them were speaking quietly, heads tilted together like men discussing a golf score instead of a divorce. When Raymond saw me, he smiled, not warmly, just confidently. Well, he said as I approached, you made it. I live here, I replied. It would be strange if I didn't. Daniel Crowley extended his hand politely. Mrs. Whitmore, Daniel Crowley. His handshake was professional, firm, brief, practiced. Helen Mercer, my lawyer said beside me. Daniel nodded. Helen. Their voices carried the calm politeness of attorneys who had likely faced each other in court before. Raymond glanced between us. I hope this doesn't take all day, he said lightly. I have a meeting later. Helen didn't even look at him. That depends on how complicated your claims are, she replied. Raymond smirked. Oh, they're very straightforward. Of course they were. We were called into the courtroom a few minutes later. The room itself was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, rows of benches, and a tall desk where Judge Harold Bennett sat reviewing a stack of files. He was an older man with a careful expression, the kind of face that had listened to too many arguments to be impressed by confidence. We took our seats. Raymond sat tall, shoulders squared, hands folded like a man attending a ceremony where he expected to be congratulated. Daniel began first. Your Honor, he said smoothly, this case concerns the division of marital assets following the dissolution of a long marriage. He spoke clearly, confidently, laying out Raymond's version of the story like a well-rehearsed performance. Raymond had been the primary financial provider. The house had functioned as the central marital residence for decades. It was therefore reasonable, Daniel argued, that the property either be awarded to Raymond or sold with proceeds divided accordingly. As he spoke, Raymond nodded occasionally, his expression calm. Everything about his posture said the same thing. This is obvious. When Daniel finished, Helen stood. She walked to the table slowly, carrying a thin folder. "Your Honor," she said, "Mr. Crowley's summary is accurate in one respect." Judge Bennett looked up. "Oh?" "Yes," Helen said calmly. "The house has indeed been the Whitmore's primary residence for many years." Raymond leaned back, satisfied, but Helen continued. "However, its legal status is not as simple as Mr. Crowley suggests." Raymond's smile faltered slightly. Daniel frowned. Helen opened the folder and placed a document on the table. "This property," she said, "was placed into a structured trust arrangement more than a decade ago." Daniel's eyebrows rose. Raymond turned toward him. "What?" Helen continued speaking, her voice steady. "The documentation shows that ownership and control of the property were transferred under specific conditions designed to protect the asset." Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses and began reading the document Helen had handed him. The courtroom became very quiet. Raymond leaned toward Daniel and whispered something urgently. Daniel's confident posture stiffened. He flipped quickly through a copy of the paperwork Helen had just provided. "That can't be correct," Raymond muttered under his breath. Helen said nothing. She simply waited. Judge Bennett read for nearly a full minute. Then he looked up. "Mr. Crowley," he said calmly, "were you aware of this arrangement?" Daniel hesitated. "Your Honor, this is the first time we've seen these documents." Raymond turned toward him sharply. "What do you mean the first time?" Daniel didn't answer. He was too busy reading. Margaret is sitting in that courtroom while her husband's entire plan starts shaking. The confidence, the months of preparation. Suddenly, none of it feels so solid. Tell me honestly, what would you do in Margaret's place right now? Write in the comments. Judge Bennett placed the document back on the table. "Well," he said slowly, "this certainly changes the discussion." Raymond stared at Helen, then at me. His earlier confidence had not disappeared completely, but it had shifted. Like a man who suddenly realizes the floor beneath him may not be as solid as he thought, and the hearing had only just begun. Raymond kept staring at Daniel as if the answer might still change. "What do you mean you've never seen that?" he whispered harshly. Daniel didn't look up immediately. He was flipping through the trust document page by page, his earlier confidence draining with every paragraph. "Raymond," he muttered quietly, "did you sign something regarding the house about 10 or 12 years ago?" Raymond blinked. "Of course I signed things. We were restructuring assets after that investment mess." Daniel finally looked at him. "Did you read them?" Raymond's jaw tightened. "That's not the point." Across the room, Helen stood calmly beside the table, waiting. Judge Bennett leaned back slightly in his chair. "Mr. Crowley," he said, "would you like a moment to review the material?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." Raymond leaned closer to him again, his voice now strained. "Daniel, this doesn't change anything. The house is ours." Daniel didn't answer right away. He was still reading. I watched Raymond's face as realization began creeping slowly into his expression. It reminded me of the time he once backed our car into the mailbox and spent 30 seconds insisting it hadn't happened while the broken wood was still falling to the ground. Denial was Raymond's favorite stage of surprise. Daniel finally placed the document down. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "we would like clarification regarding the nature of this trust arrangement." Helen nodded slightly. "Of course." She stepped forward and addressed the court. The Whitmore residence was placed into a protective trust structure following a series of financial risks undertaken by Mr. Whitmore more than a decade ago. Raymond stiffened. Helen continued. At that time, Mrs. Whitmore sought to ensure the property could not be jeopardized by future liabilities. Judge Bennett glanced at Raymond. That was a prudent decision. Raymond shifted in his seat. "That's ridiculous," he said quickly. "The house was still part of the marriage." Helen remained perfectly calm. The structure allowed Mr. Whitmore to reside in the property and continue using it as the marital home. However, the legal control of the asset itself was transferred. Daniel raised a hand slightly. "Transferred to whom?" Helen turned a page in the document. "To the Whitmore Residential Trust, with Mrs. Whitmore designated as controlling trustee." The room went silent again. Raymond stared at her, then slowly turned toward me. "You put the house in a trust?" he said. His voice wasn't angry yet. It was confused. "You signed the documents," I replied quietly. "That was paperwork after the investment loss," he snapped. "You said it was temporary." "It protected the house," I said. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Raymond, this means the property is not technically held in the standard marital structure." Raymond's face flushed. "That's absurd." Judge Bennett looked down at the document again. "Mr. Crowley," he said calmly, "the language here is quite clear." Raymond leaned forward suddenly. "So what does that mean?" he demanded. Daniel hesitated before answering. "It means," he said slowly, "that claiming the house as a divisible marital asset may be more complicated than we assumed." More complicated. That was a very polite way of putting it. Raymond turned toward me again, his expression now shifting from confusion to anger. "You planned this," he said. I didn't raise my voice. "No, Raymond," I said quietly. "I prepared for the possibility that one day you might do something reckless." Daniel sighed softly beside him. Judge Bennett closed the file. "Well," the judge said, "it appears we'll need additional review of this structure before making any determinations regarding the property." Raymond leaned back in his chair, staring at the documents as if they had betrayed him. His entire strategy had been built on one simple assumption: that the house was available to divide. Now that assumption was wobbling, and the hearing was far from over. When the hearing paused for a short recess, Raymond stormed out of the courtroom so quickly that Daniel had to grab his briefcase and hurry after him. I remained seated for a moment. Courtrooms have a particular silence once the voices fade. A heavy, thoughtful quiet, as if the room itself is still listening. Helen gathered her papers calmly. "That went interestingly," she said. "That's one word for it," I replied. She gave me a small glance over her glasses. "Raymond didn't know." "No," I said. "He didn't." Helen nodded once, as if confirming something she had suspected from the beginning. "Well," she said, "he knows now." Outside in the hallway, Raymond's voice echoed loudly enough that several people turned their heads. "What do you mean it's complicated?" he snapped. Daniel's calmer voice followed. "Raymond, Lower your voice. This is ridiculous, Raymond continued. It's my house. I stepped out of the courtroom just in time to see Raymond pacing near the tall courthouse windows. His face was red, and the confident posture he had carried all morning was starting to crack. Daniel held the trust document in one hand. I'm telling you, he said carefully, this structure changes the legal landscape. Raymond ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. No, it doesn't. Margaret put the house in some paperwork years ago because of that investment situation. That doesn't mean I lose it. Daniel exhaled slowly. It means the court may not treat it as a standard marital asset. Raymond pointed down the hallway toward me. She lived there because of me. Several people nearby pretended not to listen. Daniel lowered his voice. That's not how property law works. Raymond noticed me standing there. His expression hardened immediately. So this was your big plan? He said. I didn't move. There was no plan. You hid the house in some legal trick. You signed the documents, I said calmly. Raymond laughed bitterly. Oh, please. You expect me to remember every piece of paper from 10 years ago? No, I said. I expected you to read them. Daniel stepped slightly between us. Let's keep this professional, he said quietly. Raymond turned back to him. So what now? He demanded. Daniel glanced down at the document again. Now we review the trust structure in detail. And then we determine what claims are actually viable. Raymond's voice dropped. I told people I was getting the house. Daniel didn't respond. Raymond paced again, slower now. The anger was still there, but underneath it I could see something new creeping in. Worry. For weeks he had been walking around town telling people the house would soon be sold. Linda had likely repeated that story to half the family already. Raymond Whitmore loved certainty, but certainty was evaporating quickly. A courthouse clerk walked past us carrying a stack of files, and for a moment the hallway filled with the soft echo of footsteps and murmured conversations. Raymond suddenly stopped pacing. You did this after that investment mess, he said, looking at me again. Yes. You thought I was irresponsible. I thought the house needed protection. Raymond's laugh this time sounded hollow. So you just locked it away from me. I secured it. Daniel rubbed his temples. Raymond, arguing about this here isn't going to help. Raymond turned back toward the courtroom doors. They can't just ignore 43 years of marriage. No one is ignoring it, Daniel said. But the structure of ownership matters. Raymond stood still for a moment. Then he looked at me again. The arrogance he had carried for weeks was no longer fully intact. For the first time since he sat at our kitchen table and declared he was taking everything, Raymond Whitmore looked like a man who had started to understand something. Not everything, but enough. Enough to realize that the house he had been planning to sell might never have been his to sell in the first place. When the recess ended, we returned to the courtroom. Raymond walked in first, shoulders stiff, his jaw set the way it used to get whenever a business deal stopped going his way. Daniel followed behind him, carrying 2 thick folders now instead of one. That alone told me how quickly things had changed. Helen and I took our seats. Judge Bennett returned a moment later and adjusted the papers in front of him. Let's continue, he said. Daniel stood again, but this time the smooth confidence from earlier had faded. His tone was still professional, but there was a new caution in the way he chose his words. Your Honor, after reviewing the trust documentation presented by Mrs. Whitmore's counsel, We believe additional clarification is necessary regarding the formation and intent of the trust. Judge Bennett nodded. That seems reasonable. Helen rose. If it helps the court, she said, we can provide a brief explanation of the structure and timeline. Please do. Helen stepped forward with the calm precision she had carried all morning. The Whitmore Residential Trust was established 12 years ago, she began. At that time, Mr. Whitmore had incurred significant financial exposure related to a failed investment venture. Raymond shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I remembered that year clearly. Raymond had been convinced he was about to make a fortune investing in a restaurant chain run by a man he met at a golf club. The man vanished 6 months later, along with a considerable portion of Raymond's money. What Raymond had called a temporary setback nearly became a catastrophe. Helen continued. Mrs. Whitmore sought legal advice in order to protect the marital residence from potential financial liability. Judge Bennett glanced toward Raymond. That was wise. Raymond's lips pressed together. Helen placed another document on the table. Under the terms of the trust agreement, the property title was transferred into the trust, with Mrs. Whitmore designated as the controlling trustee. Daniel raised his hand slightly. And Mr. Whitmore signed the transfer documents? Yes, Helen replied. Daniel looked toward Raymond. Raymond avoided his eyes. Judge Bennett examined the document for several seconds. Mr. Crowley, the judge said, the language here appears quite explicit. Daniel nodded reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor. The trust grants administrative authority over the property to Mrs. Whitmore. Raymond leaned forward suddenly. But that doesn't mean she owns the house outright, he said. Judge Bennett looked at him calmly. Ownership within a trust structure can be more complex than traditional property arrangements. Raymond's voice rose. But it's still our house. Helen spoke again, still completely composed. Your Honor, the trust agreement also contains a protective clause restricting the transfer or sale of the property without trustee authorization. Judge Bennett turned another page. I see that. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Raymond looked between them. What does that mean? He demanded. Daniel exhaled slowly. It means, he said carefully, that the house cannot be sold or transferred without Margaret's approval as trustee. Raymond stared at him. What? The trust gives her that authority. Raymond's face flushed deep red. That's insane. Judge Bennett set the document down. Mr. Whitmore, he said evenly, you signed the agreement. That was paperwork after the investment mess. Yes, the judge replied. Paperwork that created a legally binding structure. The room was quiet again. Raymond looked at me like a man staring at a locked door he had only just discovered. You did this behind my back, he said. No, I replied softly. You were sitting next to me when you signed. Daniel rubbed his forehead again. Raymond? Raymond ignored him. So you just waited, he said, his voice tight. I met his eyes. I protected the house. Judge Bennett cleared his throat. At this stage, the judge said, it appears the marital residence may not be divisible in the manner originally proposed by Mr. Whitmore's counsel. Raymond sat back slowly. The words hung in the air. Not divisible. For weeks he had been talking about selling the house, planning the money, telling people how everything would be divided. And now the court was telling him something very simple. The house wasn't his to divide. And the most difficult part for Raymond Whitmore to accept was not the legal language. It was the fact that the quiet woman he had underestimated for 43 years had seen this possibility coming long before he ever asked for a divorce. When the hearing resumed again, the courtroom felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just heavier. Raymond no longer sat like a man attending his own victory. His shoulders had lowered slightly, and the neat confidence he had worn all morning had begun to unravel. Daniel shuffled through his folders one more time, clearly searching for something, anything, that might restore the ground beneath his client's feet. Judge Bennett looked down at the documents again. "Mr. Crowley," he said calmly, "do you wish to proceed with your claim regarding the residence?" Daniel hesitated. That single pause spoke louder than any argument. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "while we acknowledge the existence of the trust, we believe the court should consider the broader context of the marriage." Raymond straightened slightly, clinging to that sentence like a rope. Daniel continued. "The property functioned as the Whitmore's marital residence for over 4 decades. Mr. Whitmore contributed financially to the household during that time." Helen rose before Daniel finished his thought. "No one disputes that," she said evenly. "However, the trust structure was specifically designed to separate the asset from Mr. Whitmore's financial exposure." Daniel nodded stiffly. "But the spirit of marital equity—" "The spirit of marital equity," Helen replied calmly, "does not override a legally executed trust agreement signed by both parties." Judge Bennett raised his hand slightly. "That is correct." Raymond leaned forward suddenly. "So, you're saying she gets the whole house?" he blurted out. The judge looked directly at him. "I'm saying the house is controlled by the trust you signed 12 years ago." Raymond's face tightened. "That's ridiculous." Helen placed one more document on the table. "Your Honor, there is one additional clause worth noting." Judge Bennett examined the page. "This clause," Helen continued, "specifies that the trustee has exclusive authority to determine the future use, sale, or retention of the property." Raymond stared at Daniel again. "Exclusive authority?" he whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." Raymond's voice rose. "So she can just keep it?" The judge answered before anyone else could. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." The words landed like a hammer. For several seconds, Raymond didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the table as if the wood might rearrange itself into a different answer. Daniel leaned toward him quietly. "Raymond, we'll need to reassess the remaining assets." But Raymond wasn't listening anymore. His eyes lifted slowly toward me. "You knew this would happen," he said. His voice had lost its earlier arrogance. Now it sounded something closer to disbelief. "No," I replied calmly. "I knew this might happen." Margaret is sitting there watching the moment her husband's certainty finally collapses. All the months he spent telling people he would take the house, gone in a few quiet sentences. What would you feel in her place right now? Tell me in the comments. Judge Bennett closed the folder. "Well," he said, "that resolves the question of the residence." Raymond let out a short, hollow laugh. "For 43 years I paid for that house." Helen spoke gently but firmly. "For 43 years you lived in it." Raymond looked back at the judge. "So that's it?" Judge Bennett folded his hands. "That is the legal reality of the trust you signed." Raymond slowly leaned back in his chair. The man who had walked into the kitchen weeks earlier and declared he was taking everything had just learned something he had never expected. The house he planned to sell. The house he believed was his strongest asset. The house he had already promised to half the people in town was never actually his to take. And the courtroom was not even finished with him yet. The courtroom remained quiet for several seconds after the judge's words. You could almost hear the weight of them settling over the room. Raymond stared down at the table, his fingers resting on the edge of the documents Daniel had been reviewing all morning. Just an hour earlier, he had been sitting in that same chair, like a man waiting to collect a prize. Now he looked like someone trying to understand how the rules of the game had changed without warning. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Your Honor," he said, "given the clarification regarding the residence, we would like to shift the discussion toward the remaining marital assets." Judge Bennett nodded. That would be appropriate. Raymond finally spoke again. His voice sounded different now, not as sharp, not as confident. "So the house is just off the table?" he asked. The judge looked at him calmly. "The house is governed by the trust structure you signed. The court cannot divide an asset that is not legally structured as a divisible marital property." Raymond exhaled slowly through his nose. For a moment, the room returned to quiet paperwork. Daniel reviewing financial summaries. Helen arranging documents with the steady patience she had shown all day. But Raymond couldn't sit still. He turned toward Daniel again. "I told people we were selling the house," he muttered. Daniel didn't answer. Raymond leaned back, staring at the ceiling briefly before lowering his head again. "That's just perfect," he said under his breath. Judge Bennett looked over the remaining asset list. "There are still several matters to address," he said. "Retirement accounts, vehicles, and the lake cabin." At the mention of the cabin, Raymond straightened slightly. "The cabin is mine," he said quickly. Helen glanced at him. "The deed lists both parties." Raymond's jaw tightened again. "I paid for it." Helen didn't argue. She simply slid another document forward. "Property tax records indicate Mrs. Whitmore covered the majority of maintenance costs over the past decade." Daniel sighed quietly. Raymond rubbed his forehead. It was becoming painfully clear that the story he had been telling himself, the simple version where everything neatly belonged to him, did not match the records sitting on the courtroom table. Judge Bennett closed another folder. "This case is beginning to resemble a pattern," he said. Raymond looked up. "What pattern?" "A pattern of assumptions," the judge replied calmly. Raymond didn't respond, because that was exactly what it had been. Assumptions. Raymond had assumed the house was his. He had assumed the paperwork from 12 years ago didn't matter. He had assumed Margaret Whitmore was too quiet, too patient, too predictable to ever challenge him. And one by one, those assumptions had collapsed inside this courtroom. Daniel leaned closer to him again. "Raymond," he said quietly, "we need to focus on what can still be negotiated." Raymond nodded slowly, though the frustration on his face had not faded. Across the room, Helen closed her folder and glanced toward me. For the first time since the hearing began, I allowed myself to relax slightly in my chair. Not because everything was finished, but because the most important piece of the puzzle had already fallen into place. The house, the one Raymond had promised to sell, the one he had told everyone he was taking, the one he believed would give him control of everything. That house was never leaving me. And now everyone in the courtroom knew it. Raymond Whitmore had walked into this building convinced he was about to take everything. Instead, he was leaving it piece by piece behind him. By the time the hearing finally ended, the late afternoon sun had begun to slide through the tall courthouse windows. The room felt quieter now, not empty, just settled, like a storm that had finally finished passing through. Judge Bennett closed the final folder on his desk. "Given the documentation presented," he said calmly, "the court recognizes that the Whitmore residence is governed by the trust structure established 12 years ago." Raymond didn't move. He sat staring straight ahead, hands resting on the table as if they belonged to someone else. "The property therefore remains under the authority of Mrs. Whitmore as trustee," the judge continued. Daniel nodded slowly. Helen simply closed her folder. Judge Bennett looked down the list one last time. "The remaining assets will be divided according to the revised agreement presented by counsel. If there are no further disputes, we can finalize the dissolution accordingly." Raymond finally spoke. "So that's it?" he asked quietly. Judge Bennett met his eyes. "That is the legal outcome of the documents both parties signed." The judge gave a small nod. "You are free to go." The gavel didn't even need to strike. The case was finished. Raymond pushed his chair back slowly. The man who had walked into our kitchen weeks ago and said he was taking everything now looked like someone who had misplaced something he couldn't find again. Daniel leaned toward him. "We'll talk outside," he said quietly. But Raymond didn't answer. He stood, gathered his coat, and walked toward the courtroom doors without looking at me. For a moment I thought he might stop. Say something. 43 years of marriage is a long time to end in silence. But he didn't. The doors closed behind him. Helen packed the last of her documents into her briefcase. "Well," she said gently, "that went about as well as it could." I nodded. Yes, it did. We walked out into the courthouse hallway together. The same hallway where Raymond had stood earlier that morning, so certain of himself. Now it felt strangely peaceful. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of autumn leaves. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't angry either. Mostly, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Relief. Raymond had believed the divorce would erase me from the life we built together. But the truth was much simpler than that. The house had never been something he could take. Because 12 years earlier, when I realized how easily everything could disappear if I trusted the wrong decisions, I had protected the one place that truly mattered. And sometimes protection looks very quiet, right up until the moment someone tries to take it away. My dear friends, this story leaves us with an interesting question. Margaret protected herself long before the divorce ever happened. Some people will say she was wise. Others may think it was too harsh. What do you think? Write your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing them together.